So that we will essentially start, more or less in operation terms, about 2 weeks, Sea Guardian, the operation which will cover essentially the whole of the Mediterranean with specific focus on the central Mediterranean. Why? Because that's what European Union mission needs, if you like, our support. I think these are pretty good examples. And the third aspect, particularly, to come back to what Kristina was saying about this long-term working on the things which are not just to do with individuals and governments. Well, we call it, for us, projecting stability means, you can call it helping in development resilience, but it also means capacity building, and there are some very specific needs. That is why we are training, now in Jordan, Iraqi officers. But decision has been taken that from January, we'll do it in Iraq itself. We had an Iraqi prime minister recently, NATO, and that one is, it will happen. I could go on, maybe not for 2 hours, I'll admit, but nevertheless, I could give some other examples. But the point I'm making is that I think, particularly in this sort of difficult situations, there's clarity and the openness with which one addresses this task. It's very important because we have to avoid misunderstandings. We have to avoid some sort of collateral political damage if we do something which I think would not be appropriate. But at the same time, inaction is not an option. And the last point, if I may, East-South. If you look at the results of the last 2 summits, Wales and Warsaw, apart from all the other things, I think one common theme, and I would certainly describe it as success, in spite of what, just read what some commentators were writing, particularly before Wales, partially before Warsaw. The Allies would come, and there would be like a clash between the Southerners and Easterners, whatever you want to call it. That just did not happen. Why? Because, in very concrete terms, if we talk about increasing the capability, including military presence, but also such structures as, for example, NATO response force. Of course, we focus more in our thinking about the East, but who says it cannot be used in the South or the North? That's the point. If you develop the capabilities, then it is ultimately the political decisions. But if you don't have them, then of course you can have a lot of political discussion. So again, I could develop this point, but I think for us it's extremely important. In NATO, there is no question, each ministerial, each, frankly, ambassadorial meeting in NATO does address all of this. And ultimately, the reason is very simple. We do not choose where the challenges come from, and we have to deal with them. So, with that, I'll stop here, but I'm happy to develop some points.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for being so disciplined with the time. I'm going to open the discussion. Let me leave you with a challenge. What should we do when it comes to the southern flank? Because if we look back over the last 10, 15 years, in the case of Iraq, the West, very divided at the time, of course, decided both to intervene and to occupy Iraq. In the case of Libya, the West, in this case led by the United Kingdom and France, decided to intervene but not to occupy. In the case of Syria, it decided neither to intervene nor to occupy. Now, one could argue that the results have been equally disastrous in the 3 cases, and they exhaust the options. So what should we do when it comes to the southern flank and the growing instability, as John at the beginning so well demonstrated? Please identify yourself and go ahead.
Hi, Besma Omani, a professor at the University of Waterloo. We've been watching the Turkish and the Russians becoming very friendly lately. And I really would like to know, whether from our Turkish colleague or others, can we tell what's the deal? Do we have any sense of what may be going on? Because it seems that it's not a coincidence that we had the Euphrates Shield operation announced soon after this befriending, and any thoughts on that? The other thing too is I would love someone to give me a convincing argument for what is the Turks' intention and desire to go into Mosul. I mean, what's the passion and the reason? And I'd love more than a neo-Ottomanian argument, which I think is a bit shallow, so I'd love to hear more on the geostrategy of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really needed a short discussion on Turkey. Do you want to start at least?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm gonna start from the last question. Thank you so much for just bringing all those in the table. First of all, Turkey does not want to go unilaterally into Mosul. Like, it doesn't want to be the conqueror of Mosul or kind of like imperial or re-imperial expansion. The first imperative here for Turkey is not to be excluded from the coalition. Because we saw that being excluded from the coalition in Syria cost us like 3 million refugees, a PKK-affiliated fait accompli at our doorstep, plus being a border neighbor with ISIS, one of the most, like monstrous organizations and one of the most ambitious organizations in the region. The thing is, if you take Turkey out of the picture, and if you go into Mosul like relentlessly, and if you just create a humanitarian problem of, let's say, like 500,000 refugees, demographically the city is like mostly Sunni, predominantly like Sunni populated, and like leave Turkey for like addition than 500,000 refugees, and we don't know any sleeper cells like or the proportion of sleeper cells, and if you just like fulfill the city with Iranian-backed Shia militia, which could do like more sectarian motivated massacres and leave Turkey again yet another wave of problems, I think after 5 years of civil war, Ankara won't take it. And the other thing is like the Turkish presence, forward military presence in northern Iraq is not a new issue. It is a legacy of 1990s when Turkey first launched cross-border operations into northern Iraq, and Bashika, the contingent in Bashika, is yet another one, not the first one, but we have a difference in this time. Bashika is a result of Erbil's invitation to Turkish armed forces, and we should remember that at those times, ISIS were just artillery fire away from, like in military terms, I use that in order to be shocking because it is the reality when you say like ISIS was like 20 kilometers away from Erbil, ISIS was like 10 kilometers away from Erbil, it doesn't resonate very well, but ISIS was artillery shelling away from Erbil. At that time, Turkey was invited to consolidate Mosul. And now, all the plan changed, and if someone in Tehran or Baghdad tells Turkey that like we don't need you in Bashika anymore, well, it would be very reasonable for Ankara to say that like I'm sorry and we don't need another 500,000 refugee influx because of your sectarian policies reminding like 17th century Europe, or we don't need at our doorstep a fait accompli autonomy from Syria. That's the thing. With regards to Turkish-Russia relations, very briefly, actually, like Turkish-Russian relations has always been like very complicated, which we can just very briefly depict as frenemies. Yes, Turkey and Russia were competing in Azerbaijan, in Central Asia, that was a given, but when they were doing actually this competition, they were having billions of dollars trade volume. Yes, Turkey is a NATO member, a very important NATO member, influencing both the southern flank and eastern flank. In that case, it is unique. But also at the same time, like we just had a new visa regime when Turkey was becoming more and more important in NATO's, let's say, missile defense activities. So Turkey did not refrain from contributing to NATO's missile defense activities, but Turkey also did not cease its like trade relations and like friendly relations with Russia. Actually, like it is becoming to its senses. Yet I may put a reserve here, because up until now, the Russian base in Tartus was more of a symbolic one as a Cold War legacy. Now the Russians are operating permanently in Syria with real meaning. Like we are seeing like very advanced systems like S-400s, like SA-70s with General Breedlove called like an A2AD bubble in the Levant. The Russians are very, intensely cooperating with the Greek Cypriot administration in Cyprus, and we don't know how they would or they could just influence all this like Eastern Mediterranean security. And they're bringing new weapon systems like SS-26 Iskanders to Armenia, to Syria, encircling Turkey. So I am optimistic about Turkish-Russian relations. This is by all means not a drift of excess from the West, because it has always been. I'm not here like singing the official song in Turkey, but it has always been like that. In 2010, it was like that. Yet, with a reserved Russian contingent in Syria and its meaning in terms of A2AD. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is Ulrich?
Ulrich Beck with Elcano, Brussels. I have a question. We used to talk we need a strategy, but who is we in this case? I'm just wondering, maybe this question goes to Kristina. you always need some kind of lead nation or a coalition of the willing inside NATO, EU, to really, move towards a strategy. And of course, France would be the usual suspect for the southern flank of the Mediterranean area. But my observation is that France is doing very little in terms of coalition building, for having a broader group of interested countries that are really pushing the South forward. I mean, besides the Union for the Mediterranean, which is not very effective as an instrument. But now, as we have a new era with post turmoil in the whole region, Syria and so on, who do you think could take a lead? Do you think that France could team up more with Spain, Italy? Could they build, a caucus that is really pushing more engagement towards the east, the south? Thank you.
Good question, yeah, Kristina.
Let me shoot back. If you ask who's we, then I ask you, who's we for what? Yeah? So obviously the coalition depends on the task at hand. Yeah? I think generally you're referring to the South being France's, Italy's, and Spain's domain, whether that can lead to anything positive in terms of a push towards a different approach or something like that. I'd like to this point, to come back to what Robert was saying about the sort of East-South nexus. Because first of all, the northern countries, in particular Germany, who used to not care very much about North Africa, are also now increasingly interested in what happens in the Mediterranean. So I don't think it is any longer a domain, the Mediterranean is any longer a domain of Italy, France, and Spain. Although, of course, these three have the best contacts and, and other ones who lead the relations. But I think it is now Mediterranean is now an all EU issue. So I don't think, even if these Mediterranean countries would want to take the lead, that Germany would let them. You see? So, and also on the East-South point, I think that these clubs within the EU, the East Club and the South Club, is going away because, as most pointedly the case of Syria shows, but not only, the East and the South dimension from a European point are increasingly intertwined. And that is not only, when we look always at Syria, Russia is in Syria, but this is happening everywhere. Russia is expanding systematically its reach to the Middle East. We've talked about Turkey, but I mean, even if you go beyond the Levant, Russia's relations with Egypt, it is intensifying relations with Morocco. Now even you have a situation where Iran and Russia are both courting Sisi. So I think this is something that is a much broader theme than Syria. And this means that it can only be an all EU issue. Yeah, I don't think this is too big for the southern Mediterranean.
Max, do you want to add something very quickly?
So I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, President Putin has this very sporadic, opportunistic approach to trying to grab whatever opportunity he sees in front of him to take a move towards the West and figure out how far he can go. So the only question of we is we as a West. And this is his objective, is making sure that we is not defined by we as a whole, the alliance, including the EU in it, but rather it is Germany by itself, or it is Spain by itself, or it is Estonia by itself. And this is what we are seeing, is the answer should be we, but it's not enough we so much. It's, how do we shift away from that, sporadic we that we have been having to the we as a whole?
Thank you. We have 5 minutes, so let me get 3 questions together. One here, one there, and there was one in the middle. So just these 3. I'm sorry, we don't have enough time. I think this lady here in black, and then you, and And the gentleman there.
Eva Horolová, I'm the Syria Policy Officer for the European Union. So I have a Syria-specific question. So you were really concentrating on the security and military part for me. So I would like to go back to the political part. And the question is the power sharing actually really possible according to the Geneva Communique? And if yes, what can we do, we as the European Union or the Western world, to put really pressure on the Syrian regime to actually involve in the political deal in Syria, and how such a power sharing could look like? Thank you.
I didn't get a few words.
Yeah.
Could you repeat? You said, is it? I think the microphone is not very clear. Could you repeat it very quickly?
Okay. Well, the question is like the Syria situation was pretty much like looked at through the military and security part, but we are still saying there should be a political solution. And according to the Geneva Communique, it should be power sharing between the opposition and the Syrian regime. Geneva Communique of 2012.
Okay, thank you very much. Question there.
Thank you very much. Marcin Buzanski from Pulaski Foundation. My question really is about two countries, so a kind of northern and western flank for them, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And how is that playing into our calculations of the southern flank? And I think you can build up the rest for the response for that. Thank you.
The gentleman there in the middle. And I'm sorry, this has to be the last question.
Thank you very much. I don't mean in any way to doubt what Mr. Kasapoğlu said about the role of Turkey in the region, and particularly in relation to the number of refugees that are being taken care of within Turkey and in the European Union. Obviously, everyone realizes the very important role that of this fact. However, I'm from the University of Nicosia, by the way, and coming from Cyprus, though, I just mention one point in relation to possible military movements in the region, which is that 42 years ago, Turkey intervened militarily in Cyprus, and they're still there. So one should be aware of this. Of course, we are negotiating, and we hope that we're moving towards the achievement of a solution. And so I hope that this situation will not continue very much longer. Okay, just another point, though, in relation of something that Mr. Kasapoğlu said. As far as I know, the Cyprus government has very good relations with Russia, and of course also with the United States, with France, and with other countries, many of which use harboring facilities in Cyprus. But this is the and the British, of course, have military bases on Cyprus.
I will have to ask you to clarify a little bit. You said, I hope this situation doesn't go on for much longer. Which situation? I wasn't completely sure. I don't know if the panel
The situation of the military occupation in the northern part of Cyprus by Turkey.
Okay.
The solution of the Cyprus problem and the success of the negotiations would, of course, involve the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Cyprus.
Well, this seems to be
I just wanted to make a clarifying comment. I mean, this is
sure.
This is what I wanted to
This seems to be a bright spot. Cyprus, of course, I'm not inclined to include it in our southern flank, but it is a bright spot. Does anyone want to address it? And then the political solution for Syria, I think you were talking about, and then Iran and Saudi Arabia. Who wants to start? But do try to address the three questions. You don't have to address them all, each of you.
I actually will try to the following freak. I will not try to answer a specific question, but I'll offer something which I hope at least goes some way into the overall picture. I think it's like this. First of all, there's a lot of, we have to be realistic. There's a lot of problems, specific, some of them, intractable, long-term, etc., which, we're not going to solve. Whether it's we or we and the others, right? Coming back to the we. I think, coalitions are necessary for a variety of reasons. But the biggest standing coalition, frankly, should be a coalition of the countries, of the people who stick to certain principles. I'll illustrate this. Remember the famous, I'm sure Max remembers, the famous tweet from the Russian embassy in Washington 2 weeks ago. Had a photo of Grozny, right? And I was put as the center of Grozny. Indeed, there's a lot of new buildings, etc. And this was juxtaposition to the current situation in Aleppo, right? And the argument was, well, you see, that should be the model. Well, no, it shouldn't. And regardless where you are on this or that issue, I mean, that should be a natural reaction. Sorry, flattening, by the way, your own city, right, to the ground, killing, what was it, 160,000 people, is not a way forward. So something which happened many years ago cannot be said for all those reasons. And I think this is very important because that is the way that you build a coalition which involves not only countries, not only institutions, but actually international public opinion, which we should not forget. And I think there is also, speaking last point, on this East-South and some of these issues which potentially look like, you know, in competition, you have to, there is a responsibility on the part of, if you like, the intellectual part of the world, of the experts and others, the media. You have to connect the dots. So you have to make an additional effort. It's not enough just to be sort of focusing on one issue because, again, the world is like it is. If it's complicated, we have to complicate ourselves.
Okay, maybe Max is a good candidate to answer your question about Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then we can have Kristina and John very quickly.
I probably am the worst candidate to answer Saudi Arabia and Iran, to be honest. But what I can do is I can tap a little bit in the question of the political solution. I think you're onto something. It's actually not so much a political or military solution, it's more a narrative solution. We don't have a common narrative when it comes to the South. We have all sort of different opinions of what is happening, whereas Russia's having a very clear narrative that is completely fictional, and it's like a children's book, but it's actually working perfectly fine. They keep on standing in the position that they are, they keep on being supported on it, and people in the West still somehow think and romanticize that, in fact, maybe we can find a political solution in Syria. If you have a counterpart sitting across from the table from you that they say they will go and strike ISIS, and then what they do is something completely opposite, and they eradicate everyone that somehow had the chance to stop the Assad regime, which is, by the way, a completely institutionalized modern dictatorship that is systematically eradicating anyone who's standing up against it, then thinking of a political solution is a daydream, unfortunately. I don't advocate there should be a military solution to Syria, but we really have to think about what we have left in our toolbox to force Russia to come to the political table and to the discussion table, because right now they're just performing a show and we are totally trapped in that show at the negotiation table.
Well, like, okay, I'm gonna be very brief about the Cyprus issue. Like, I will try to be very objective, and I won't make it as, you know, like as usual, one of our Greek Cypriot very distinguished colleagues like asking a question and like one of the Turkish academics like answering in the very official framework. But I like to be as thought-provocative as you, sir. The thing is, like, in 1974, when Turkey launched its military operation into the island of Cyprus, there was already a UN mission for a decade. And the UN missions generally are not launched for, you know, like, for like diplomatic contacts or for celebrating some kind of like local festival. So which means that like the Turkish military intervention, the Turkish military operation in Cyprus came after a decade of hostilities, after a decade of ethnic cleansing attempts. I don't blame a society as a whole. I wouldn't say by the Greek Cypriots, but I would say by a radical clique in the state apparatus of this republic. So this is very important, like we see in the Middle East, we see in the Levant region. We recently saw in the failed coup attempt in Turkey when a radical clique get its grip on the security apparatus, and when they are notoriously gifted with like racist, radical, ultranationalist views, what kind of humanitarian disasters that they could cause. So we should see this very fact that like after a decade of ethnic cleansing and hostilities and ethnic conflict, the Turkish military intervention in Cyprus just happened. That's the first thing. Do we want to see a viable negotiation and status quo, an end to the Cyprus problem in the island? Of course we do. But everyone from north, from Turkey, from south, like everyone would like to see such an accomplishment in the Eastern Mediterranean. But on which basis? I think we should learn from the mistakes of our immediate neighbors, which means like Syria, Lebanon. If you just establish a system based on inequalities and based on the ghosts of the past and based on like radical or irredentist or let's say like ultra-nationalist movements, it won't be viable. And still, like, when talking about this, like 1974, if we just like keep insisting on these kind of words like occupation, invasion, that I don't think that would help to establish a bright future that would be viable and that would serve the best interests of the next generations in Cyprus. And with regards to special relations between the Greek Cypriot government and Russia, I'm a defense analyst. Like, I don't see any kind of Greek Cypriot procurements in terms of strategic weapon systems as an equivalent of S-300 from any Western nations. I don't see like...
We'll have to stop. I'm just going to give 30 seconds, 1 minute tops to Kristina, but I'm getting signs that we are already like 7 minutes over time. Kristina, do you want to just very, very quickly, I'm sorry, this 45 minutes to discuss the southern flank is very harsh.
Okay, I was just going to speak faster, no. Saudi Arabia and Iran. I was talking earlier about the different layers of fragility. And Saudi Arabia and Iran confrontation is like the middle layer, regional power competition. And I think Iran is clearly on the winning end, Saudi Arabia is on the losing end, and knows it, and therefore has a position as a sort of a wounded lion, and as such tends to lash out, which is of course very dangerous. So, and also, just two small parentheses. One, the fact that Iran has now built up basically Hezbollah into a regional army, a Shia army, which is being deployed in Yemen and likely to be deployed elsewhere as well, together with the Quds forces. And I think it is likely that Iran will later, with his regional ambition, is likely to go more into the Gulf and also try to spread its influence in North Africa. And so I think this is a very dangerous competition that we see that leads to a lot more problems also because these two must be balanced, but the balancing itself creates new problems. For example, the fact that the US tries to appease Saudi Arabia leads to relatively, a blank check in what it does in Yemen, where they have, I think, 90,000 casualties. Yeah, so.
Thank you to all the panelists. And thank you to the audience. I think we still have 5 minutes until the next session, so that's not so bad.